and I, when I first picked these passages and started writing these questions, we hadn't gone into we didn't have the incidences that led to the protests that are going on in the US right now. And yet it so exactly, and sadly and tragically, it carries out what I'm saying here is that we have a physical contagion. And then coming out of this is kind of a spread of mob hysteria that I think is partly sparked. I mean, it's partly sparked by legitimate outrage at police brutality, but I think partly fueled also by the kind of repressed energies that the shut-in period from COVID-19 has left us with. So I've probably said too much already, but other people, I'm sure, want to jump in.
No, I agree with you saying there, Natalie. That sorry.
Go ahead.
Someone's going to talk then? No, just to agree that yes, that a lot of the current protests going on have very legitimate reasons, but are being fueled in part by the circumstances we're in, that we are partly in a position of distrusting those in power quite strongly, yes, because of recent events.
Yes.
I think had events occurred at other times when we weren't in lockdown, there would have been a more moderate reaction, possibly. It's hard to say. We'll never really know. But we've had protests in the past, but the protests this time feel somehow different and more, yes, energized than ever been before as well. And whereas before you can normally guess, well, this will end in a few days, there isn't that certainty this time when, if it will end as well. We're in a very different set of circumstances now.
I think you're dead on that, you know, some of this is being driven by being locked down, right? By that pent up energy. But some of it is being driven also by a profound distrust of our leadership, and the sense that the system is broken. And that was something that Dickens was really good at getting at, right? He was really good at getting at, in the sort of Victorian framework of thinking again about moral environmentalism, that the same problems that drive economic despair and terrible health conditions and a terrible environment that causes those terrible health conditions also drive behaviors that I might find praiseworthy under the current circumstances, but that Dickens found maybe less praiseworthy. That these are all part of one system, right? Yeah. Of basically, you know, economic injustice and what we might call climate injustice.
Yep.
And so, I mean, you know, Bleak House is the sort of perfect example of that. And of course, our mutual friend extends that further into a kind of critique also of the monetary system.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I find it interesting that the differences between what Emily described as the sort of justification for coming out of lockdown in England compared to what we have here, at least the sort of state justification is much more a sort of madness of economy, right? Yeah. You know, the fact that we don't care as much for actual individual people's sanity or mental health, but the health of the larger sort of capitalist system, right? So it's the psychology of capitalism, you know, like in the second part of Little Dorrit, when we've got that chapter, The Progress of a Pandemic, right? Which has the sort of myrtleism spread from Panks to Clenham to, it's really interesting to try to make sense of the differences between the two different reactions in our own pandemic today, between our two countries, and what that might have to do also with resistance.
Can I add too that, I mean, it's interesting that we have gone so far in the direction of dealing with and worrying about somatic illness, right, rather than mental health, because of all 19th century writers, Dickens was probably most closely attuned to, or was one of the most closely attuned to, the problem of mental health. I mean, you know, you need look no farther than a figure like Miss Havisham, right, whom he talks about having a diseased imagination, and if only she had let in the light of day, essentially. But I think, you know, there the light of day is meant to cover a variety of things, including sort of healthful human contact and interaction. No one was, I think, probably more suspicious of human beings trying to live in isolation than Dickens was. I mean, it's all over his remarks about solitary confinement in the prison system, his characters who are isolated, like Miss Wade in Little Dorrit, tend to be sort of psychologically problematic. I think he was a real believer in the efficacy of community and empathetic relationships with people. And so, you know, to the extent that even in the current pandemic, we're ignoring to some extent the mental health of persons who are having to live in isolation, right? And understandably, we're concerned about sort of the somatic problems raised by the pandemic, but there are mental health consequences to all of this, and I think Dickens probably would have understood those quite well, even if he didn't necessarily have the modern terminology to describe them or cope with them.
There's a very good question from Megan Bitzelman in the chat that sort of feeds into what you're saying about communities there, and also particularly about the protests in America at the moment against the police, in that some of the passages we've had on previous slides are about using the police to control contagion, or the idea of society pushing it into particular areas. And how do you think we should understand Dickens's portrayal of legal intervention to control contagion of different kinds versus other ways of intervening?
I mean, this looks ahead to the passage from Pictures from Italy, in that Dickens is so invested in subverting the regulations. You know, maybe this is a good time to look at that passage.
Yeah.
He's disobeying, he's subverting regulations here.
Yeah, this is I don't know if this is on the this is the one in passage 6. Yeah, so this is from Pictures from Italy, and this links to what you were saying, Emily, about that passage from the opening of Little Dorrit of quarantine. Now, I mean, of course, it's imperative to note that, of course, this quarantine is not a medical quarantine. This is a quarantine of economics. That this is where Dickens has come back on a boat, and the boat is being held in quarantine because there's concerns that the goods on there might not, you know, be proper goods, and they have to be checked. So there's no risk to anybody's life or health here when Dickens is, as Lillian says, subverting the rules. But what you get is effectively Dickens in lockdown. I mean, I chose this passage when things were, if the word is correct, more cheery in lockdown. I think when we first went into lockdown, there's almost a sense of kind of novelty about it. Like, oh, well, this is going to be quite interesting, which again speaks of privilege, because for a lot of people, lockdown was immediately a much more terrifying thing. But for many people, we were like, well, what a novelty, being at home, being with the family, won't that be lovely? Which speaks of our own privilege of how lucky some of us can be in our home lives. And this is Dickens in that camp of being, well, I'm locked down, but the brave courier has gone back to the dockside and brought back a lovely banquet, and now we and my fellow inmates are having a lovely banquet and a joyful time. So this is a very positive spin on lockdown, which, I say, a few weeks back was perhaps more able for some of us to respond to, whereas now I think the narratives have got a lot darker there as well. So yes, I think Dickens is someone who would look to subvert the rules to an extent. Would he be talking to neighbours over the fence? Yes, certainly. Would he be doing a conga on VE Day? I hope not. Would he be driving to Barnard's Castle to check his eyesight? Again, I sincerely hope not as well. But there are ways in which you can see he's looking at what he can do to make it more pleasant and to find a more optimistic way around this. So I don't think Dickens would be following the rules exactly, but I'd hope he'd be following them generally. I don't know how others feel about that.
But I think that it also has to do with one's respect for the people who are making those rules. I mean, here, Dickens has put himself in the hands of basically a local guide. And so that's part of it. Part of it is that he thinks the Italian, way of administering rules is preposterous. And of course, they get out of lockdown like the next day, even though they're supposed to be in it for 2 weeks. And it's all a mystery of like why these decisions are made. Again, in Bleak House, Joe becomes someone who spreads disease all over because he's being moved on, right? He's being moved on by the police, but he's being moved on because Tulkinghorn doesn't want him there. And so Tulkinghorn is actually intervening in and using the police for his own selfish ends. And because of that, he drives Joe out of his home and into the environment and up to the Jarndyce's home. And that is what spreads the disease. So the misuse of power, the misuse of rules is there coming from, I think, coming from within the system.
Agreed. I mean, I think the police, like the Contagion, should be democratic, but in reality, it's not, because people can use and change system as they want to. So I say Tolkien can use that to his own advantage. Dickens here is in a position where he can bend the rules where others would not be able to as well. So it's not fair. It depends on where you are and how you're able to subvert that system, either mildly or in a more malicious way as well. So there's a lot there that Dickens is writing about that does speak to current concerns, and Megan's question about the police, that I think in theory it's a good force if used correctly, and that awareness that Dickens has that it can be used unfairly, that Joe has no defense against being told to move on, that those who don't have power and prestige have to follow the law, whereas those slightly higher up can choose to follow the law, and that difference there, and how that causes greater issues in society than those who are lower down and not following the law.
I mean, he certainly aligned himself with policing, his outings with Inspector Field and his determination to control people who he thought weren't behaving properly. So, but of course, he himself did not like being controlled. He really had a problem with being controlled by others. So it's sort of interesting to think about this passage in those terms as well.
I mean, you said mention Field, but also obviously then his fictional counterpart of Bucket in Bleak House. He's such a bizarre character because he's actually rather unsympathetic a number of times. He's not the man of the people. He knows the people, but for that reason, he's even more pressing upon them at times as well. So there's a kind of recognition that the police are there at the forefront and should be getting to know those who they're helping or enforcing, but also with that comes a distancing from it as well, or an expectation of how they respond to those people too. So even as Dickens is championing, I mean, Bucket is seen as like the first great detective, but even he is not a straightforward, heroic figure either.
Right. It's the system, as they tell. I cannot remember the name of the man who was finally broken by his resistance to the
Ridley.
And every time he says, this is unjust, or who can help me? What do I need to do? He's told it's the system. There's nothing we can do, right? Just like Voles, right? Voles is very respectable. He's a cog in a machine. We can't let Voles suffer because he's such a good hard worker in this system.